Every Saturday, I made a point to visit my favorite local coffee shop. It had a cozy ambience, with mismatched furniture and the comforting aroma of freshly ground coffee beans. I loved how the baristas knew my order. An almond milk latte, extra foam, with a sprinkle of cinnamon on top. It felt like a small slice of normalcy in my otherwise chaotic life. That particular Saturday, the cafe was unusually crowded. I scanned the room, looking for a place to sit. A few tables were occupied, most by solitary patrons glued to their laptops. But one table in the corner caught my eye. A man sat there, hunched over a book, his brow furrowed in concentration. He seemed out of place, as if he belonged to another time altogether. I settled into the seat across from him, my usual table taken. The warmth of the cafe wrapped around me as I pulled out my phone, scrolling through social media while I waited for my drink. The barista called my name, and I stood to pick up my order. As I returned to my table, I couldn't help but notice the man watching me. He had dark hair, neatly combed, and a well-trimmed beard. His eyes were sharp, observing everything around him with an unsettling intensity. I felt a shiver run down my spine but dismissed it as paranoia and took a sip of my latte. The minutes ticked by, and I found myself stealing glances at the man. He hadn't moved from his spot, still engrossed in his book, but occasionally, I caught him looking at me. Each time our eyes met, I quickly averted my gaze, a sense of unease settling in my stomach. Finally, the man closed his book and stood up. He walked past my table, brushing against my shoulder ever so slightly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and smooth. "Do you mind if I sit here?" I hesitated, unsure of what to say. It's a bit crowded," I stammered. "I promise I won't take up much space," he replied, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his lips. Something about his smile made me uncomfortable, but I nodded reluctantly. He settled into the chair across from me, his presence overwhelming the small table. "I'm Jason," he said, extending a hand. I shook it, my skin crawling at the contact. "I'm Emily. So, what brings you here on this fine Saturday?" he asked, his eyes never leaving mine. "I just needed to get out of the house," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "I work from home, and it gets lonely." He nodded, seeming to contemplate my words. "I understand. Sometimes it's nice to be around people, even if you don't talk to them." I smiled nervously, feeling trapped under his gaze. The conversation felt forced, and I looked around the cafe, trying to gauge the atmosphere. Everyone else was immersed in their own worlds, oblivious to the tension building between us. "Do you come here often?" he asked, leaning in slightly. "Yeah, most weekends," I replied, taking a sip of my latte to buy myself time. "It's my little escape." "I can see why," he said, his voice low and smooth. "It has a certain charm." I nodded, feeling the conversation dwindle into an uncomfortable silence. I could sense something off about him, a darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. The way he watched me felt predatory, like a hawk eyeing its prey. Just then, my phone buzzed on the table, breaking the tension. I glanced down to see a text from my friend asking if I wanted to grab dinner later. I sighed in relief, grateful for the distraction. I looked up to tell Jason I needed to go, but he was staring at me with an intensity that made my heart race. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice dripping with concern, though I sensed an underlying menace. "Yeah, just a text from a friend," I said, trying to sound casual. He nodded slowly, but I could see the flicker of irritation in his eyes. "You should be careful about who you spend your time with," he said, leaning closer. "Not everyone has good intentions." A chill ran down my spine at his words. I wanted to leave, to escape the oppressive atmosphere that surrounded us, but I felt rooted to my chair. "I should really get going," I said, forcing a smile. "Don't leave just yet," he replied, his tone shifting, the warmth replaced with a chilling undertone. "I find you fascinating." My heart raced as I stood, clutching my bag tightly. I really need to. Before I could finish my sentence, he reached out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was firm. Stay just a little longer. I promise I'm not a bad guy. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. Let go of me, I shouted, yanking my arm away from him. He blinked, taken aback, but then a twisted smile crept across his face. You're feisty. I like that. I turned to leave, my heart pounding, but he quickly rose to block my path. You think you can just walk away? You don't even know me. I don't want to know you, I replied, my voice shaking. His expression darkened. But I know you, Emily. I know everything about you. Fear gripped me as I backed away, searching for an escape. What do you mean? He leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. I've seen you before. You have a routine and I've been watching. You're predictable. My stomach twisted at his confession. This isn't funny. Let me go. He chuckled softly, an unsettling sound. You're making this difficult. I just wanted to have a conversation. I pushed past him, darting toward the exit. The cafe door swung open, the sound of the bell ringing in my ears as I burst into the street. The cool air hit me like a splash of water, but I didn't stop. I ran, not looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. I made it to my car, fumbling for my keys as I glanced around, panic rising within me. My hand shook as I finally got the door open and climbed inside, locking it behind me. I took a moment to breathe, trying to calm my racing heart, but then I noticed him in the reflection of my rearview mirror. Jason stood outside the cafe, watching me with a chilling smile. I started the car, my hands trembling as I reversed out of the parking space, not daring to take my eyes off him. As I drove away, I could feel his gaze burning into my back, a lingering sense of dread following me. My mind raced with thoughts of what he had said. He knew where I lived, what my routine was. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like a rabbit caught in a snare. Once I got home, I hurried inside and locked the door behind me, breathing heavily. The familiar surroundings that had once offered comfort now felt suffocating. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see him lurking outside, but the street was empty. I tried to calm my racing heart by distracting myself with a movie, but my mind wouldn't let go of what had happened. I jumped at every sound, convinced he would appear at any moment. My phone buzzed with notifications, but I ignored them, too anxious to check. As night fell, the shadows in my apartment grew longer, stretching into grotesque shapes. I tried to convince myself I was safe, that he wouldn't find me, but a nagging feeling in the back of my mind told me otherwise. I needed to report him, to let someone know about what had happened. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. 911, what's your emergency? The operator answered, her voice steady. I was just followed home by a stranger, I said, my voice trembling. He wouldn't leave me alone at the coffee shop. He knew my name. Can you provide a description of this person? She asked. I paused, trying to remember every detail. He had dark hair, a beard. He seemed charming at first, but then he became aggressive. Did he threaten you? She asked, her tone serious. No, not directly, but he implied he was watching me, I replied, panic rising in my throat. Stay on the line, ma'am. I'll dispatch an officer to your location, she said, her voice calm. I hung up, pacing my apartment, the walls closing in around me. Every creak of the floorboards sent my heart racing. I glanced at the clock, the minutes feeling like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. Finally, there was a knock at the door. I jumped, my heart racing as I rushed to open it. 2 officers stood there, their faces serious. Are you Emily? One asked. Yes, I said, my voice shaky. They entered, assessing the situation. I explained everything, recounting the encounter at the cafe and my fear that he would come after me. We'll take this seriously, one officer assured me. Can you show us the cafe where this happened? I nodded and they asked me to lead the way. As we drove to the cafe, I felt a mix of relief and fear. I was no longer alone, but the thought of facing Jason again terrified me. When we arrived, the cafe was closed, the lights dimmed. The officers walked around, looking for any sign of him. They questioned the baristas who were cleaning up and reviewed the security footage. After a long wait, the officers returned. We didn't see anyone matching that description. One said, his expression serious. But we'll keep an eye on the area. I felt a wave of disappointment wash over me. What if he comes back? We'll patrol the area, the other officer assured me. And if you see him again, call 911 immediately. I returned home feeling more exposed than ever. The night stretched on, my sleep fitful and filled with nightmares of Jason's predatory gaze. The next day, I found myself looking over my shoulder, jumping at every noise. Weeks passed, and I tried to return to normalcy, but the fear never left me. I switched coffee shops, changed my routine, and avoided being out alone at night. Yet no matter what I did, I felt his presence lurking in the shadows. Then, one night, as I was leaving a different cafe, I spotted him across the street. My heart sank, and I ducked into an alley, pressing my back against the cool brick wall. I watched as he crossed the street, his eyes scanning the area, searching for me. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find me. The world around me faded, leaving only the sound of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. Just when I thought he had passed, I felt a chill wash over me. He stopped just a few feet away, looking down the alley. Our eyes met, and a smirk spread across his face. "Emily," he called, his voice smooth and taunting. "I've been looking for you." I turned to run, my heart racing as I dashed down the alley, my mind screaming for me to escape. I burst onto the street, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment, fumbling with the keys and practically throwing myself inside. I locked the door, breathing heavily as I leaned against it. The encounter replayed in my mind, and I knew this wasn't over. He was relentless, and I was trapped in a nightmare of his making. I needed help. I couldn't do this alone. I contacted a friend, desperate for comfort. "Just stay with me tonight," I pleaded over the phone. "Of course. I'll be there soon," she replied, her voice reassuring. As I waited for her to arrive, I looked around my apartment, trying to find a sense of safety, but the shadows seemed to stretch longer, the darkness closing in. I thought of Jason, his eyes watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. When my friend arrived, I felt a wave of relief. We talked late into the night, her presence grounding me, but the fear still lingered, like a shadow hovering just outside my window. As dawn broke, I vowed to reclaim my life. I wouldn't let him control me. I decided to take self-defense classes to empower myself against the unknown. With every lesson, I felt stronger, more confident. I learned to face my fears head-on. But even as I trained, a part of me remained vigilant, aware that Jason was still out there, lurking in the shadows. Weeks turned into months, and while I became more adept at defending myself, the haunting feeling never truly faded. I learned to trust my instincts, to remain aware of my surroundings. Then, one fateful day, as I was leaving my self-defense class, I spotted him again, waiting at the edge of the parking lot, leaning casually against a lamp post. This time, however, I didn't run. I stood my ground, heart pounding, preparing myself for what was to come. "Emily," he called, his voice smooth and infuriatingly calm. "I've missed you. Stay away from me," I replied, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "Why, we were just getting to know each other," he said, taking a step forward. I remembered my training and took a defensive stance. "I won't hesitate to call the police if you don't leave." His smile faded, and for a moment, the facade cracked. "You think you're safe?" he said, his voice low and threatening. In that moment, I felt a surge of adrenaline. I turned and sprinted toward my car, heart racing, knowing I had to get away from him. I reached for my keys, fumbling as I tried to unlock the door, but he was right behind me, his breath heavy. Just as I got the door open, he lunged for me, grabbing my arm. I twisted, using the techniques I had learned, breaking free from his grip. "Get away from me!" I screamed, adrenaline fueling my escape. I jumped into the car, slamming the door and locking it as he shouted after me. I started the engine and drove away, the roar of the car drowning out his voice as I sped down the street. I could feel my heart racing, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. I had faced him, confronted my fear, and escaped. But I knew this was just the beginning. Jason was relentless, and I was ready to fight back. I wasn't going to let him win. Not now. Not ever.